The scent of burnt toast was the last straw for Clara as she juggled her toddler and an overdue bill notice on the kitchen counter. Her 3-year-old son, Max, was tugging at her sweatpants, asking for a snack, while the toaster stubbornly continued to smoke. Clara sighed, yanked the plug, and opened the window to let the smell out. Life as a single mom wasn't just hard. It was exhausting. Between her part-time job at the diner, taking care of Max, and trying to stretch every dollar, she felt like she was constantly one step away from falling apart. She glanced at the crumpled bill on the counter. It was from the electric company, stamped with a bright red final notice. Clara crumpled it further, shoving it into a drawer. No point in worrying about it now. She had $42 left in her checking account, enough for groceries for the week if she was careful. As she grabbed Max's jacket to head to the store, she noticed her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harper, sitting on her porch across the street. The old woman was a fixture of the neighborhood, always perched on the same chair with a mug of tea in her hands, staring out at the quiet suburban street. Clara hadn't seen anyone visit Mrs. Harper in the 3 months since she'd moved into the little house, not long after her divorce. Mrs. Harper was small and frail-looking, with neatly combed silver hair and a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She always gave Clara a polite nod when their eyes met, but they'd never exchanged more than a quick hello. Today, though, Clara noticed something different. The older woman's hand trembled as she lifted her mug, and her gaze seemed far away, heavy with sadness. "Mommy, who's that?" Max asked, pointing across the street. "That's Mrs. Harper," Clara said. "She lives there by herself." "She looks lonely," Max said matter-of-factly, his little forehead wrinkling in concern. Clara hesitated. She had enough on her plate, bills to pay, meals to make, and a mountain of laundry that never seemed to shrink. But something about the way Mrs. Harper sat there, so still and alone, tugged at her heart. Later that afternoon, as Clara unloaded groceries from her car, she saw Mrs. Harper struggling to carry a heavy paper bag up her front steps. Without thinking, Clara set down her own bags and hurried across the street. "Let me help you with that," she said, reaching for the bag. "Oh, thank you, dear," Mrs. Harper said, her voice soft but warm. Up close, Clara noticed how thin she was, her skin pale and lined with age. The bag was filled with canned goods, far too heavy for her small frame. "I'm Clara, by the way," she said, as they stepped inside the tidy but quiet house. "I live right across the street, and this is Max." She gestured to her son, who had followed her across the street and was now peeking curiously around the doorway. Mrs. Harper smiled at Max, her expression softening. "Hello there, young man. I'm Mrs. Harper." Clara took in the living room as she set the bag on the kitchen counter. It was spotless, but eerily quiet, with neatly arranged furniture and a row of family photos on the mantel. Most of the photos were faded, showing a younger Mrs. Harper with a man who Clara assumed was her late husband. In one picture, they stood in front of the house, smiling brightly, the yard filled with blooming flowers. "Thank you for helping me," Mrs. Harper said, interrupting Clara's thoughts. "I'm not as steady on my feet as I used to be." "It's no problem," Clara said. "If you ever need anything, just let me know. We're right across the street." Mrs. Harper gave her a grateful smile but said nothing. Clara hesitated for a moment, then ushered Max back home, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She couldn't stop thinking about the quiet sadness in Mrs. Harper's eyes, how lonely her house had felt. That night, as Clara tucked Max into bed, he looked up at her and asked, "Mommy, why doesn't Mrs. Harper have anyone to help her?" Clara paused, smoothing his hair. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe she doesn't have family nearby." "Can we help her?" Max asked, his big brown eyes serious. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, but the truth was, she already felt like she was barely holding things together. Still, the thought of Mrs. Harper sitting alone in that silent house weighed on her. Maybe a small act of kindness wouldn't cost her much. Just a little time. The next evening, as Clara washed dishes, she glanced out the window and saw Mrs. Harper sitting on her porch again, her tea growing cold in her hands. Clara dried her hands, took a deep breath, and crossed the street. "Hi, Mrs. Harper," she said, her voice a little nervous. "I was wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner tomorrow night. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal. I thought it might be nice to get to know each other." Mrs. Harper looked up, surprised. For a moment she didn't say anything, and Clara worried she'd overstepped. But then the older woman's face softened into a warm smile. "That's very kind of you, dear. I'd love to." Clara smiled back, feeling a small flicker of warmth in her chest. "Great. Come by around 6?" Mrs. Harper nodded, and Clara walked back to her house, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. It wasn't much, but maybe reaching out to her neighbor was exactly what they both needed. The smell of tomato sauce simmering on the stove filled Clara's modest kitchen as she set the table with mismatched plates. Dinner was simple. Spaghetti with homemade sauce, a loaf of bread she'd picked up on sale, and a small salad made from the last of the lettuce in her fridge. It wasn't much, but it was warm and inviting, and Clara hoped it would make Mrs. Harper feel welcome. Max was busy arranging his toys on the living room floor, occasionally holding one up to ask if Mrs. Harper would like it. "Do you think she likes dinosaurs, Mommy? Or maybe cars?" "I think she'll like whatever you show her, sweetheart," Clara said, smiling at his enthusiasm as she straightened the silverware. She couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. It had been a long time since she'd had anyone over for dinner, let alone a neighbor she barely knew. Still, there was something about Mrs. Harper that felt familiar, like they were two people navigating different kinds of loneliness. At exactly 6 o'clock, there was a soft knock at the door. Clara wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened it to find Mrs. Harper standing there, clutching a small plate covered with a checkered napkin. "Good evening, dear," Mrs. Harper said with a warm smile. "I brought a little something. It's just some cookies I baked earlier. I hope that's all right." "That's perfect, thank you," Clara said, stepping aside to let her in. She noticed Mrs. Harper had taken care to dress nicely, wearing a simple blouse and cardigan that looked freshly pressed. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, framing her kind, lined face. "Hello, Max," Mrs. Harper said as she stepped into the living room. "What are you playing with there?" Max jumped up, clutching a plastic dinosaur. "This is T-Rex. He's the king of dinosaurs. Do you like dinosaurs, Mrs. Harper?" Mrs. Harper chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "I think T-Rex looks very impressive. You'll have to tell me all about him after dinner." Max grinned and ran back to his toys, clearly thrilled by her attention. Clara led Mrs. Harper to the dining table, where the older woman surveyed the modest spread with an approving nod. "This looks lovely," Mrs. Harper said as she sat down. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble," Clara said, pouring them both a glass of water. "I'm glad you could join us." As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Mrs. Harper complimented the spaghetti, saying it reminded her of the meals she used to make with her late husband, Henry. "He loved a good home-cooked meal," she said, her voice soft with nostalgia. "We used to host dinners all the time. Friends, neighbors, anyone who needed a warm meal and good company. This house was always full of laughter back then." Clara glanced at Max, who was busy twirling spaghetti onto his fork, and felt a pang of sympathy. "It must be hard," she said gently, "losing someone you've shared so much of your life with." Mrs. Harper nodded, her smile tinged with sadness. "It is. Henry and I were married for 52 years. We never had children, something we always thought we'd do but never quite got around to. And after he passed, well, I suppose I lost touch with most of our old friends. People mean well, but life moves on, doesn't it? Clara nodded, understanding all too well how quickly people could drift away. "I'm sorry," she said. "It sounds like you had a wonderful life together." "We did," Mrs. Harper said, her eyes brightening as she looked around the room. "The house holds so many memories. I still tend to the garden out back. It was Henry's pride and joy. He always said a well-kept garden was a sign of a happy home." Clara smiled, picturing the blooming flowers she'd seen in Mrs. Harper's yard. "It sounds like he was a special man." "He was," Mrs. Harper said, her voice soft. "But enough about me. Tell me about you, Clara. How are you managing with this little one on your own?" Clara hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something about Mrs. Harper's gentle demeanor made her feel safe. "It's been challenging," she admitted. "After the divorce, things were tight financially. I work part-time at the diner, which helps, but it's hard to make ends meet. Some days, I feel like I'm just barely keeping my head above water." Mrs. Harper reached across the table and placed a hand on Clara's. "You're doing the best you can, and that's more than enough. Max is lucky to have such a strong, caring mother." Clara blinked back unexpected tears, touched by the sincerity in Mrs. Harper's voice. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." By the time they finished their meal, the room felt lighter, filled with warmth, and the faint sound of Max giggling as he showed Mrs. Harper his favorite toys. The older woman laughed along with him, her face relaxing in a way Clara hadn't seen before. For the first time since they'd met, Mrs. Harper looked genuinely happy. As Clara cleared the dishes, Mrs. Harper insisted on helping, despite Clara's protests. "Nonsense," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "I may be old, but I'm not useless." They worked side by side in the small kitchen, chatting about everything from gardening tips to Max's favorite bedtime stories. Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at ease with someone. When the dishes were done and Mrs. Harper prepared to leave, Max ran up to her with a drawing he'd made, a colorful scribble of flowers and dinosaurs. "This is for you," he said proudly. Mrs. Harper took the drawing with a smile, her eyes misting. "Thank you, Max. This is the most beautiful gift I've received in a long time." Clara walked her to the door, feeling an unexpected sense of gratitude. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It's been really nice having you here." "The pleasure was mine," Mrs. Harper said, clutching Max's drawing to her chest. "You've brought so much life into my evening. I can't tell you how much I've missed that." As Mrs. Harper crossed the street to her house, Clara stood in the doorway, watching her disappear into the warm glow of her porch light. She felt something shift inside her, a quiet realization that reaching out to Mrs. Harper had filled a void she hadn't even known was there. Back inside, Max was already curled up on the couch, his eyelids drooping. Clara tucked him into bed and sat for a moment in the quiet of her small home. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel so heavy. In the weeks that followed their dinner together, Clara and Mrs. Harper fell into an easy rhythm of companionship. Mrs. Harper would often appear at Clara's front door with a small bouquet of flowers freshly cut from her garden, their vibrant colors brightening the little kitchen. Clara, in turn, would drop off meals now and then. A hearty stew or a loaf of banana bread, making sure Mrs. Harper had something warm to eat on nights when she didn't feel like cooking. Max became a frequent visitor to Mrs. Harper's home. He'd sit cross-legged on her living room rug, listening in rapt attention as she told stories about her childhood. Mrs. Harper would pull out old photo albums, showing Max black and white, pictures of her first bicycle or the house she grew up in. It was clear that Max brought a youthful energy back into Mrs. Harper's quiet life, and Clara was grateful to see her neighbor's face light up in ways it hadn't before. One Saturday afternoon, Clara and Max visited Mrs. Harper's garden. It was a small but enchanting space, bursting with flowers of every color. Roses, daisies, tulips, and even a patch of lavender that filled the air with its soothing scent. Mrs. Harper handed Max a small watering can, guiding him as he carefully watered the plants. "Your garden is beautiful," Clara said, running her fingers over the delicate petals of a rose. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Harper replied. "It's been my sanctuary over the years. Henry and I planted most of this together. Every bloom reminds me of him." She paused, then added with a small smile, "And now, it reminds me of you and Max, too." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't realized just how much their friendship had come to mean to her. But hearing Mrs. Harper's words made her heart swell. "We're lucky to have you in our lives," Clara said sincerely. Later, as they sat in the garden sipping iced tea, Mrs. Harper glanced toward Clara's house and said, "You've been so kind to me, Clara. More than I ever expected when I moved here." Clara shook her head. "You've been just as kind to me, Mrs. Harper. I don't know what I would have done these past few weeks without your friendship. It's been a hard year, to say the least." Mrs. Harper nodded thoughtfully, noticing the way Clara's gaze dropped to her lap. After a moment, Mrs. Harper reached over and patted Clara's hand. "You remind me a bit of myself when I was younger," she said. "Determined, hard-working, and carrying more on your shoulders than anyone realizes." Clara smiled faintly, but didn't reply. As the afternoon wore on, Clara offered to help Mrs. Harper tidy up the garden shed. While searching for a pair of gloves, Mrs. Harper noticed an envelope sticking out of Clara's tote bag on the patio table. The bright red "Final Notice" stamped across its surface was hard to miss. Clara caught Mrs. Harper's glance and quickly snatched up the envelope, shoving it into her bag. "It's nothing," she said hurriedly, her cheeks flushing. Mrs. Harper set down the gloves she'd been holding and gave Clara a soft but steady look. "Clara, is everything all right?" Clara hesitated, her pride warring with the urge to confide in someone. She let out a shaky breath and said, "It's just an overdue bill. Things have been tight since the divorce and, well, I'm doing the best I can, but it's not always enough." Mrs. Harper reached for Clara's hand, her touch gentle but firm. "I'm so sorry, dear. I had no idea things were so difficult for you. But you don't have to carry this burden alone." Clara smiled weakly, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I appreciate that. But I've always been the kind of person who figures things out on her own. I don't want to be a bother to anyone." "You're not a bother," Mrs. Harper said firmly. "You're a friend, and friends help each other." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The conversation lingered in Mrs. Harper's mind long after Clara and Max left that afternoon. She sat in the quiet of her garden, thinking about Clara's struggles and the love she poured into raising Max despite her difficulties. Clara reminded her of herself in her younger years, when she and Henry had faced their share of hardships, but had always found a way through. Mrs. Harper thought about the savings she and Henry had built up over the years. They'd been careful with their money, always planning for a future that never fully came to pass. After Henry's passing, she had lived modestly, keeping the savings intact, unsure of what to do with it. But now, as she looked around her garden, blooming with life and hope, she felt a sense of clarity. The following week, Clara and Max visited Mrs. Harper again. As Max played with a small wooden wheelbarrow Mrs. Harper had found in her shed, Mrs. Harper handed Clara a sealed envelope. "What's this?" Clara asked, confused. "Just something I'd like you to have," Mrs. Harper said, her tone light, but her eyes filled with meaning. Clara opened the envelope and gasped. Inside was a check for $10,000 and a handwritten note that read, "Dear Clara, this is not just a gift. It's my way of saying thank you for the kindness you've shown me. You and Max have brought so much light into my life, and I want to do something to help lighten your load. Henry always believed that money should be used to make a difference, and I can't think of a better way to honor his memory than by helping you build the future you and Max deserve. With love, Mrs. Harper. Clara's hand trembled as she read the note. Mrs. Harper, I can't accept this. It's too much. It's not too much, Mrs. Harper said gently. It's exactly what Henry and I would have wanted. And it's not just the money. I've spoken to an old friend of mine who owns a little shop downtown. She's looking for a part-time bookkeeper, and I told her you'd be perfect for the job. It's flexible, so you'll have more time with Max. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she looked at Mrs. Harper. I don't know how to thank you. You already have, Mrs. Harper said, her voice thick with emotion. You've given me a sense of purpose again. Seeing you and Max thrive will be thanks enough. Surrounded by the vibrant blooms of Mrs. Harper's garden, Clara felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the money or the job. It was the realization that she wasn't alone, that someone truly cared. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel so daunting. It felt, in a word, possible. Clara sat at her small kitchen table long after Max had gone to bed, the envelope from Mrs. Harper resting in front of her like an impossible puzzle she couldn't solve. The check and note were still inside, their weight far heavier than the paper they were written on. She turned the envelope over in her hands, her emotions a mix of gratitude, disbelief, and guilt. The money could change everything. She could pay off the overdue bills she'd been dodging, fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, and finally enroll Max in the preschool program she'd been eyeing for months. But accepting it felt wrong somehow, like she was taking advantage of Mrs. Harper's kindness. The next morning, Clara stood on Mrs. Harper's porch, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. She knocked softly, half hoping Mrs. Harper wouldn't hear. But within moments, the door opened, and Mrs. Harper greeted her with a warm smile. Good morning, Clara, she said. Come in, dear. I was just about to make tea. Clara stepped inside, her nerves evident in the way she hesitated near the doorway. Mrs. Harper, I need to talk to you, she said, holding out the envelope. I can't accept this. It's too much. Mrs. Harper sighed, her face softening as she gestured for Clara to sit. Let's talk about this over tea, she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Clara reluctantly took a seat on the couch, the envelope still in her lap. Moments later, Mrs. Harper returned with 2 steaming mugs and set them on the coffee table. She sat down across from Clara and folded her hands in her lap. Clara, she began, her tone gentle but resolute. This isn't just about money. It's about doing something meaningful with what Henry and I worked so hard to save. But it's so much, Clara said, her voice trembling. You've already done so much for me and Max. I don't want to take advantage of your generosity. Mrs. Harper shook her head, a wistful smile playing on her lips. When Henry and I started saving, it was for a dream we never got to fulfill. We planned to travel the world in our retirement, places we'd only ever seen in books, Paris, Rome, the English countryside. But life had other plans. Henry got sick, and by the time I lost him, the idea of traveling alone felt hollow. She paused, her eyes misting as she glanced toward the mantel where a photo of Henry stood. For years, I didn't know what to do with that money, she continued. It just sat there, untouched, waiting for a purpose. And then you and Max came into my life. Clara, helping you feels like the most meaningful thing I could do with it. Henry would have wanted this. He always believed in using what we have to make life better for others. Clara blinked back tears, her heart aching at the sincerity in Mrs. Harper's voice. I don't know how to thank you, she said softly. Mrs. Harper reached out and placed her hand over Clara's. By letting me do this, she said, and by promising me one thing. What's that? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Promise me you'll use this to build the best life you can for yourself and Max, Mrs. Harper said. And when the time comes, if you're ever in a position to help someone else, You'll pay it forward." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She clutched the envelope to her chest, the weight of its significance finally settling in. Over the next few weeks, Clara began to put Mrs. Harper's gift to use. She paid off the overdue electric bill and a few other debts that had been hanging over her like dark clouds. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the constant pressure of financial strain. She also enrolled Max in the preschool program she'd been dreaming about. On his first day, Clara watched as he ran into the brightly colored classroom, his face lit up with excitement. It was a bittersweet moment. She was proud to give him this opportunity but couldn't help feeling the sting of how impossible it had seemed just weeks ago. The bookkeeping job Mrs. Harper had arranged turned out to be a perfect fit. The shop, a quaint little bookstore downtown, was owned by a kind woman named Margaret, who treated Clara with warmth and respect. The flexible hours allowed Clara to pick Max up from preschool every afternoon, something she cherished deeply. As Clara's life began to stabilize, the changes were evident even in her home. The pile of unopened bills on the counter disappeared, replaced by a small vase of fresh flowers that Max insisted on picking from Mrs. Harper's garden. The leaky faucet no longer dripped, and the air in the house felt lighter, less burdened by unspoken worries. One evening, Clara invited Mrs. Harper over for dinner again. This time the mood was celebratory. Clara made roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, a meal she hadn't been able to afford in months. Max proudly showed off the art project he'd made at preschool, a colorful paper butterfly he insisted was for Mrs. Harper. "You've outdone yourself, Clara," Mrs. Harper said as they sat down to eat. "This smells wonderful." Clara smiled, her cheeks flushing. "I wanted to do something special to thank you. I can't tell you how much everything you've done has meant to me." "I can see it," Mrs. Harper said, glancing around the cheerful kitchen. "And that's thanks enough for me. Seeing you and Max happy is all I could ever ask for." Clara hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about what you asked me, to pay it forward someday. I want you to know I will. I don't know how or when, but I'll find a way to share the kindness you've shown me." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened, her smile tinged with pride. "Kindness has a way of coming back around," she said. "And even if it doesn't, it's its own reward. You don't owe me anything, Clara. Just keep doing what you're doing, raising that wonderful little boy and building the life you both deserve." As the evening wore on, Clara felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the money or the job, but for the bond she and Mrs. Harper had built. What had begun as a simple act of neighborly kindness had grown into something much greater, something that felt like family. When Mrs. Harper left that evening, Max ran to the window to wave goodbye. Clara stood by his side, watching as Mrs. Harper crossed the street to her house. The glow of her porch light illuminated her small frame, and Clara realized it was more than just a light. It was a symbol of connection, of hope, and of the community they'd found in each other. For the first time in years, Clara felt like her life was moving forward, not just surviving. And she knew, deep in her heart, that she'd do everything in her power to keep that momentum going. For herself, for Max, and for the neighbor who had become so much more. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware filled Clara's small but cozy dining room. Tonight was a celebration, and the warmth in the room reflected just how far they'd all come since that first, tentative dinner months ago. Max sat at the table, swinging his legs under his chair as he proudly showed Mrs. Harper a drawing he had made at preschool, a colorful picture of their little neighborhood with stick figures labeled Me, Mommy, and Mrs. Harper. "Well, isn't this just lovely?" Mrs. Harper said, adjusting her glasses to get a better look. "You've got a real talent, Max. I'll have to find a special spot for this on my fridge." Max beamed at the compliment, and Clara couldn't help but smile as she set a dish of roasted vegetables on the table. The meal was modest but hearty: baked chicken, mashed potatoes, and a green bean casserole Clara had found a recipe for earlier in the week. The table was set with her best dishes, still mismatched, but carefully arranged, and a small vase of flowers that Max had picked from Mrs. Harper's garden earlier that afternoon. "Everything smells wonderful, Clara," Mrs. Harper said, her hands resting lightly on the tablecloth. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the small but meaningful details: the fresh flowers, the clean countertops, the absence of the stack of unopened bills that had once occupied the kitchen corner. Clara sat down and poured glasses of iced tea for everyone. "Thank you," she said, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I wanted to make tonight special. It's been a big week for us." "And a well-deserved celebration," Mrs. Harper said with a nod. She turned to Max with a smile. "How was your first week of preschool, young man?" Max launched into an enthusiastic recounting of his week, his words tumbling over each other as he described his new friends, the songs they had learned, and the art projects he had made. Clara watched him with a mix of pride and gratitude, marveling at how much he had blossomed in such a short time. When Max finally paused to take a bite of his chicken, Mrs. Harper turned to Clara. "And how about you, my dear? How's the new job treating you?" Clara smiled, setting down her fork. "It's been wonderful. Margaret has been so kind, and I really enjoy the work. It feels good to have a routine and to know that I'm contributing to something. Plus, the hours are perfect. I get to pick Max up from preschool every day, which means everything to me." Mrs. Harper's face softened, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "I'm so glad to hear that, Clara. You've worked so hard, and it's clear how much you care about giving Max the best life possible." Clara hesitated for a moment, then said, "I actually wanted to share something with you." She reached for her purse, which was hanging on the back of her chair, and pulled out a small notebook. "I've started keeping track of my expenses and setting aside a little bit from each paycheck. It's not much, but I've been able to start a savings account for Max's future." Mrs. Harper took the notebook from Clara's hands and flipped through the neatly written entries. Her lips trembled slightly as she looked up. "Clara, this is remarkable. I'm so proud of you." Clara smiled, her eyes misting. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. That kindness has a way of coming back around. I want to make sure Max grows up knowing that, and that he has opportunities I never thought I could give him. This is just the beginning, but it feels good to have a plan." Mrs. Harper reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand. "You've come so far, Clara, and I have no doubt you'll go even further. Seeing the life you're building for yourself and Max has been one of the greatest joys of my life." Clara's voice wavered as she said, "You've been such a big part of that, Mrs. Harper. You're not just our neighbor, you're part of our family now." Mrs. Harper's eyes filled with tears, and she dabbed at them with her napkin. "And you've given me a family when I thought I'd never have one. Being part of your lives has brought me more happiness than I ever imagined possible." The moment was interrupted by Max, who climbed down from his chair and ran to the corner of the room, where a small pile of toys was stacked. "Mrs. Harper, I have something for you," he said excitedly. He returned with a lopsided paper crown he had made at preschool, decorated with glitter and stickers. "It's for you. Because you're special, like a queen." Mrs. Harper laughed, her tears turning to joyful chuckles as Max placed the crown carefully on her head. "Why, thank you, Max," she said, adjusting it slightly. "I don't think I've ever had such a beautiful crown before." The room filled with laughter, the kind that comes from a place of pure joy and connection. As they finished their meal, the conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from Max's newfound love of dinosaurs to Mrs. Harper's memories of her own childhood. After dinner, Clara brought out a small dessert. Peach cobbler, made with fresh fruit Mrs. Harper had given her earlier in the week. They ate it together at the table, savoring the sweetness of the moment as much as the food itself. When it was time for Mrs. Harper to leave, Max ran to the door to give her a hug. "Don't forget your crown," he said, pointing to the glittery creation still perched on her head. Mrs. Harper chuckled and adjusted the crown. "I wouldn't dream of it," she said, kissing him lightly on the forehead. Clara walked her to the door, her heart full. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Harper," she said softly. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for what you've done for us." "You've already repaid me 100 times over," Mrs. Harper said, her voice thick with emotion. "You and Max have given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Family." Clara hugged her tightly, then watched as Mrs. Harper walked back to her house. The porch light flickered on as she stepped inside, casting a warm glow over the quiet street. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She thought about how much had changed since that day she first invited Mrs. Harper to dinner. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had grown into something far greater, something that had changed both of their lives for the better. As she closed the door and turned off the kitchen light, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect, and there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face them. She had Max, she had hope, and she had Mrs.